So, with that, I'm imagining most of you guys here are pretty familiar with what happened in Barnes Lake. But if you haven't, if you are don't know what's going on, you came to the right place. So we're gonna kick it off, and I'm gonna introduce Jared Towers. If you're familiar with the Biggs cataloging of killer whales, you'll definitely recognize his name. He is the executive director for Bay Cytology and has been involved in a lot of killer whale research and also some other response efforts with killer whales ending up in places that they shouldn't be. So, with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Jared.
Thanks, Tamara. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay. Well, we'll just wait for the presentation to get loaded here. And yeah, if everybody can see that and hear me, I'll just carry on. So thanks for the introduction. My name is Jared Towers. I work with Fisheries and Oceans Canada, mostly on cetaceans at risk in Canada. And I'm also the executive director of Bay Cytology, which does a lot of different research on killer whales in different parts of the world, but primarily on Biggs killer whales in British Columbia. And that's what ended up in Barnes Lake. So I went up there, and I'll tell you a little bit about the response with the next slide. So the response centered around these two Biggs killer whales, which showed up in Barnes Lake back in September. And at least that's when I was notified about it back in the first week of September. They actually swam into the lake on August 24th, if I remember correctly. If we go to the next slide, we can see that what I was forwarded was a photograph of this individual here. And I was asked by some colleagues at NOAA if I could recognize what ecotype it was. And really, it was easy to tell just from that little tiny nick at the top of the fin on the next slide that this is T51. So not only do we know the ecotype, but we know the individual. And we can see that he's not a very common whale. Since 1987, he's been seen 46 times, or at least been photo identified 46 times, at least in the database that I maintain on behalf of Fisheries and Oceans Canada. And on the next slide, you can see that the life history of this individual, according to our FinWave database at least, you can see that the last sighting of him was right at the top. It's kind of small print, but he was observed in July off the west side of Vancouver Island by Marcy Collard in July, and he was with an animal named T49A2. So we didn't get a good photo of the other individual to start with, but on the next slide, when Dr. Dave Bain went up a couple days before, myself and Chloe went up and was able to get this photograph, and we could all see that that little nick at the top of the fin and the bend, and you compare it to the next slide, and you can tell indeed this was T49A2, a fairly well-known individual. It's been seen every year since he was born in 2007, 171 sightings in the database. And on the next slide, you can see his life history. A lot of sightings around Vancouver Island, and he's been seen in Washington and also up in Alaska a bit as well. So on the next slide, we can see that once we got up into the Kaufman Cove, part of Prince of Wales Island, the entire community, or at least the majority of it, as seen in this photo, came out to help with this response effort. And there was a lot of rescue planning. And you can see Kaufman Cove over here on the right. It's just down in the bottom right corner of the chart. And over on the left-hand bottom corner, you can see Barnes Lake. So it's actually not a lake. It's a saltwater lagoon with an east entrance or exit and a north entrance or exit. And those killer whales were in there. And by this point, when we got up there, they've been in there for 6 weeks already. So on the next slide, our first objective was to build a hukilau. And thankfully, we had a lot of help from the people of Kaufman Cove. We had a great venue to work in. We had a whiteboard to draw some plans on, and we had all kinds of extra rope, which is exactly what we needed to build a hukilau. And a hukilau is something I've used before with an entrapped Biggs killer whale in BC on the next slide. And this little individual named T46C2, or Sam, was in a place called Bent Harbor in 2013. And after a couple of weeks, this individual was starting to get very malnourished and had a peanut head and was making a lot of distress calls and could have easily swam out the exit of this harbor, but it just needed some coaxing, and we used a hukilau to get it out. So we started building this hukilau as seen in the next slide. And a hukilau is basically, if you can picture a Hawaiian grass skirt, you have all these lines hanging down from a horizontal line that's floating on the surface. And dolphins of all kinds find these things very unfamiliar, and they don't like passing under them for whatever reason, even though they can with very low risk of entanglement. And so we weighted down all these vertical lines with a little lead weight at the bottom, and they just clipped onto the surface line as seen in the next slide, with Dave and I coiling it up. And on the next slide, and the next slide after that, you can see we're loading it on the boat and it's ready to go. So in addition to the hukilau on the next slide, you can see we had some okumi pipes, and everybody in the community was given a pipe, at least for every single boat that was participating in the response. And you can see the boats in the next picture. And probably the most boats that have ever been in Barnes Lake at one time. It's not an easy place to get into because there's tidal rapids. You can only get in or out a couple times a day, depending on the tide. And you've only got a very narrow window to be able to get in and out of there. So in the next slide, you can see that I also brought up some underwater playback speakers, or Lubell speakers, underwater speakers, and a bit of a library of different calls that had been recorded and selected by my colleague James Pilkington and I, based on our knowledge of T51 and T49A2, who they like to spend their time with, and also what was in the call library for other individuals. Individuals that they like to hang out with, individuals that are still alive, individuals that have been recorded when there is no boat noise in the background, no wave noise, high quality recordings, and a number of other factors went into selecting these recordings as well. And I broke them down into very short snippets, 1 or 2 calls at a time, just because I thought if we had to resort to playbacks, we might have to leave a kind of a breadcrumb, a breadcrumb trail of playbacks to get them out of there. But in reality, I thought we'd be able to use a hukilau, and it might work. And so if you go to the next slide, we can start talking about using playbacks in a previous entrapment in Comox Harbor. This is to my knowledge, the first time that it had been done. But T-73B was in Comox Harbor in 2018 for a couple of weeks. He was getting into a lot of trouble with boats. It's a very busy harbor, and just his behavior was very disruptive, not only to the safety of humans, but also himself. And so I resorted to using a playback to get him out of there of some of his friends, the T-77s, and it worked great. So we kind of thought, well, we've done this once, maybe we can do it again. And we weren't quite sure if that was a possibility, because these things are very experimental in nature. You don't know what's going to happen because you don't know what you're playing back to them. And in any case, if you go to the next slide, we can see that on this response, we had an initial response on one day, and on the next slide, you can see that what we had to do was we used a playback to get these individuals up into the north part of Barnes Lake. And if you hear this recording, well, this is the recording that we played back to them. And on the next slide, that was some T3 calls. And this is a similar response which was an immediate response to the playbacks once we got the playback volume set up. And on the next slide here, if we go full screen mode again, you can see that T49A2 started responding quite strongly to the playback. T51 also did as well. He wasn't breaching though, but he was moving very quickly towards our boat. And the reason we used a playback in the beginning was because we needed to lure these whales up to the north exit, because they were in the main part of the lake. And as the tide set up just right, with all the kelp beginning to lay down in that northerly pass, that's the time that we needed them to come up there, and they weren't there. So we had to use a playback to lure them up to that spot, which we did. This is T49A2's response to that. He was quite excited, and the vocal response that we just played back. And in the next slide, you can see these whales were heading right towards the boat that Chloe and I were on, the playback boat. And out behind them were our two boats, and they're deploying the hukilau, and you can see some other boats out behind those as well, ready with the okumi pipes. And on the next slide, you can see that what happened was T51 ended up coming into the exit channel, and the tide was running so strong. And by this point, which we wanted to be running a bit because we needed the kelp to lay down. But even though we couldn't see any kelp at this point because it was underwater, it was just a few feet under the surface. And he came into the exit channel, and he got a bit freaked out and did a 180 on the surface. And if you go to the next slide, you can see it's an enlargement of his dorsal fin on the left there. And you can see all the kelp piled up against the base of his dorsal fin. And T49A2 didn't even try. He kind of waited at the entrance. And so these guys headed back into the lake. On the next slide, you can see that we had to leave, but these whales swam right around the hukilau because the hukilau wasn't extended from shore to shore yet at this point. And then those whales swam past the boats that were banging in the okumi pipes back into the lake. And unfortunately, that was our only window that day. And so we were a bit upset, to be honest, because we'd tried so hard and come so far, but we knew we had a couple more days, in hand if we needed them, and we did. So we all got out of the lake. You can see the rapids are forming here. We needed to get out pronto, which we did. And on the next slide, we got back to Snowpass Seafoods, and we regrouped with Dr. Mendikio at the lead there, trying to organize our next approach. And what we came to think was the best idea on the next slide is going in and trying with a second response the next day, again at high tide, and using the east exit or east entrance to get these whales out. And apparently that's the way that these whales were observed coming in. And the problem, or the reason why we didn't choose this approach on the first response approach the previous day was because the east exit is very shallow and very windy, and it's a bit longer. So we just thought, well, our best shot is a north exit, and in this case, we tried that, so we went for the east exit on the second day. So on the next slide, we also used playbacks. The whales were out in the middle of the lake, and unfortunately, they weren't near anywhere where we could hope to hukilau them into place. And so we needed to use playbacks. And you can see that if you just heard that, you saw the T3 call in the beginning, and then the response was a T7. And again, I used a bit of a breadcrumb trail of playbacks, four, in fact, to get them to the entrance to the exit channel. And these are some of their responses to those additional playbacks. Pretty excited T7 calls with these little squiggly ends to them over and over again. And what we would do, we would make a playback, and then we go a few hundred meters, cut the engines, do another brief one, and we ended up inside the entrance to the exit channel. And that was our final playback, which got them into the exit channel. And from there, we stopped with the playbacks, and the two hukilau boats extended the hukilau across the entrance. We go to the next slide. You can see this is a whale coming for us. And then we got inside here, did a final playback. And as soon as we made that final playback, we got the drone up in the air. And if you play this, we can see that this is sped up 400%. So these whales weren't actually going this fast. They were doing about 7 knots. So this is a very shallow part here. You can see that they can't dive. Their dorsal fins are above the surface of the water the whole time. That was probably the trickiest part. And you can actually, with it sped up 400%, you can see they're moving their heads back and forth a lot, potentially looking for the source of those playback calls. And here we're in front of them just in case we needed to keep luring them out, which we didn't. But they also sped up once they got around this corner, and they were doing about 9 knots. And they weaved their way through this double S turn. And you go to the next slide, and you can see that once they were just past this past this maple tree here in the back. The exit channel opens up into Lake Bay, and we had slowed the boat down and kind of let them pass by us. They did a long dive, and we weren't quite sure where they're going to pop up, and they ended up popping up in front of us. And we thought, well, they're out. And so we radioed everyone in the lake and let them know. And there was a lot of cheering and celebrating. And if you go to the next slide, you can see that. And the next slide after that, that's them leaving the exit channel. And we followed them out into Clarence Strait and just documented their behavior. They kind of weaved around, they stuck together. And we last left them southbound in Clarence Strait. Now, on the next slide, you can see that T49A2 eventually left T51 or vice versa. And T49A2 joined up with T124C, another adolescent male, well known. And T49A2, to my knowledge, is being documented on 3 different occasions. The first one was it was late November, so it was about 2 months later. I saw him in Blackfish Sound near Alert Bay, where I live. And then a few days later, he was down in Puget Sound. And then a few days later, he was back up in Johnson Strait. And there's probably a few sightings in between there as well. And T51, because he's not as common, he hasn't been seen since, but I'm sure he'll show up, in the next year or two at some point. And with that, that's basically my interpretation of a summary of the response. You can go to the next slide and see that. I just want to thank everyone who was involved in this response. It was a total team effort, which couldn't have been done without everybody that was there. Everyone played a really important role, from the other people directly involved with the response to all the people of Kaufman Cove who were also present for the whole thing and helping us do what we needed to do to get these whales out of there. So thanks, and I'll look forward to any questions at the end of all the presentations.
Thank you so much, Jared.
You're welcome.
On my end, we didn't hear the sound, and I think the problem was Sherry was muted since she was sharing your presentation. So I don't know if you want us to go back to those sounds and see if we can get them to play with them unmuted, or if anyone wants to hear those, we could give that a shot.
We could give it a shot maybe at the
Okay.
end of the meeting if people are interested. But the pretty basic regular T3 calls were, some of the playback material, and then those responses were kind of aberrant T7s. Really interesting to hear. If people are interested in hearing it later, feel free to play them then.
Okay, great. All right, well, thank you so much. With that, we will go ahead and move on to Dr. David Bain. So Dr. David Bain has been researching killer whales for over 40 years. He's been with Orca Conservancy since 2012, and he has done everything from researching acoustic disturbances to water temperature and chemistry. And he's been involved in some pretty interesting things, including this instance in Barnes Lake, which was not his first time. This was actually his second time. So Dave is going to be talking about comparing the 2 experiences from 1994 of offshore killer whales to 2003 with the Biggs killer whales. So with that, we'll go ahead and give the floor to Dave.
Okay, thank you. So we have probably 3 different species of killer whale living in this area. And globally, killer whales seem to be divided into different niches. And the main factors in that seem to be diet and water temperature. So we've got temperate killer whales here and 3 different diets. Our local JK&L pod are residents, which are fish eaters. And then in 2023, we had TO51 and TO49A2 in Barnes Lake. And then back in 1994, we had AP pod, which are offshores, and they eat things like sharks and sea turtles. So, those are kind of the players we had in the 2 entrapments. And give you an idea of where Barnes Lake is, you can see Seattle all the way down at the bottom of the screen. And then to get to Barnes Lake, we flew to Ketchikan, and in '94 got a seaplane up a little bit northwest of Barnes Lake, stayed at a place called Wales Resort. And then in 2023, we took the ferry over to Prince of Wales Island and got a ride up to Kaufman Cove and worked out of there. And as Jared showed you, Barnes Lake is really a big tide pool, and it's got an entrance out the north and an entrance out the east. And also, as Jared pointed out, this east channel is pretty shallow and narrow and curvy and has choke points on it that the whales would be reluctant to go through. So in '94, we tried this north channel, but as Jared showed you, that north channel was pretty blocked with kelp. This east channel, a lot of the water is too shallow for kelp to grow in. So we kind of have to rely on a really high tide to give the whales enough water to swim through. So Jared commented about that big rock in the channel that the whales went over the top of, and they were too tall to get through without their dorsal fins breaking the water. And at low tide, that rock is high and dry, to give you another perspective on how shallow it is. Transients tend to be much bigger whales than offshores, so adult males can get up to lengths approaching 30 feet, whereas adult male offshores only get up to about 20 feet. And I think that turned out to be important when comparing the 2 years, because Jared mentioned that the big male got stuck in the kelp, but our smaller male in '94 made it through. And then this gives you an idea of how thick the kelp is. And it's close up, and you see at low tide, it's going to be very challenging to get through it all. There are some differences in how the whales behave. Let's see, I don't know if you're going to be able to see my cursor or not, but anyway, in '94, the whales stayed in the main section of the lake, so kind of a rectangle that's started near the mouth of the east entrance and went over to the mouth of the north entrance. And you can see little islands where it says Barnes Lake Cabin, and that would be about as far down that shoreline they went, and then would cut across and kind of see a peninsula hanging out, so they didn't go into that little estuary down at the bottom of the screen. The 2023 whales went all the way down into that little estuary at the bottom and kind of went up to the edge of the big island and sort of halfway up the channel to the north end. So that was one of the behavioral differences we saw. Another one was the strength of the blows. So 2023 whales had normal blows. You can see it kind of hanging in the air. And then if you look closely just behind the blowhole of T51, you can see a little bit of indentation, but not very much. And similarly with T49A2, there's a little bit of indentation, so it's kind of just the start of Peanut Head, but it's not very far progressed. You can also see how curved his fin is. Soft curving fins are a sign of illness, but they're also a sign of adolescence. So as an adolescent male, a fin that curves like that is not necessarily outside the normal range. One of the things that was different in 2023 is we thought about trying to cut a channel through the kelp. And, the thought was if we cut the bulbs off so that they didn't have any flotation, that they kind of sink to the bottom and leave a pathway for the whales to get out. turns out that was a false assumption because the kelp was sturdy enough that even without that extra flotation, it still stood up pretty straight at high tide. So that was kind of another incentive to go with that east channel once the first try at the north channel failed. Okay, and here I was planning to show a video of how the rescue progressed in '94, but apparently copyright rules won't let me do that. So I'll just kind of try to talk you through it. In 2023, Jared talked about how he tried to attract the whales to the boat, and then we used the hukilau to kind of close the door behind them. But in 1994, we decided to repel the whales, and we used the Oakomi pipes. And that was a long process. I think we did have even more boats in '94 than we did in 2023. So I think the '94 team probably has the record for most boats in the lake at once. But anyway, we kind of had the boats ring the edge of the lake and start pounding on the Oakomi pipes. And that led the '94 whales to bunch up into a tight group kind of in the center of the lake. And then we had the boats move offshore towards the whales, and they kind of hung out in the center for quite a while. But then they started moving towards the North Channel as we intended, and kind of moved partway up, and we got all the boats to kind of form a plug with about 3 layers down at the south end of that channel. And one of the things I didn't tell people that I probably should have is I expected that when they went into that North Channel, instead of going out, they were going to take a right turn into a little cove. Let's see if I can get back to this one. So let's see. There's kind of this cove off here, so I figured that we'd drive the whales up and they'd kind of get to here and they'd see this kelp bed up ahead and decide to turn into here, which is what they did. But apparently everybody freaked out when they did that because nobody knew where they were. But then I sent one of the boats with the Oakomi pipes in to chase them back out into this channel. And then as we got them closer, we kind of put a boat here to block off access to the side channel here. And then we kind of got them to hang out here for a little while and waited for the current to kind of knock the kelp down a little bit. And once it did, the big male went through and kind of opens up as far as the kelp is concerned, because even though it's narrow, it's deeper so that there's more room over the top of the kelp. And once he made it through, everybody else followed and went out the channel. And once they were here, that's open water. As Jared mentioned, you kind of had people get the boats together and celebrate with each other. And we did follow them for a little while. And the difference between '94 and 2023 is we think the whales started feeding right away. So they went on a long dive, and after they came up, a bunch of gulls surrounded them, which kind of suggests that they left some fish bits in the water, when they came back up. And then they kind of took off at a very fast pace after that for a little while, and then seemed to tire out and start traveling at a normal pace. So, one of the big differences between the '94 whales and 2023 whales is the '94 whales were moving very slowly, They weren't doing any long dives. Their breaths were weak. They had algae growing on their skin, whereas the 2023 whales were doing 15-minute dives and, moving the mile across the lake in just a few minutes. And, I mentioned that the 94 whales kind of slowed down after a short sprint. And unfortunately, we had to leave them behind at that point. But as Jared mentioned, we were able to follow the 2023 whales for about 2.5 hours, and their straight line travel was about 10 miles in that time, and definitely was not a straight line because they detoured to visit some reefs and stop by some humpback whales and carry on. So their actual speed was higher than that 4 knots on average, which is a pretty good pace for whales. Another big difference between 94 and 2023 is that 2 of the whales in 1994 died. Noah's attitude was quite a bit different in 94. So when we first talked about trying to do a rescue up there, they offered to arrest me because it's illegal to harass marine mammals, and you kind of need a permit to do that. And I had to go to the Seattle office and get a research permit and go up and do research. And as I was arriving, we flew in and we saw a dead whale on the beach, which was kind of a good sign that they were in trouble. And went out the next day and got the behavioral data that said they were in trouble. And then the stranding office issued us a permit, and we were able to proceed with the rescue. 2023, it's kind of Noah said, "We'd like to have a rescue done. Can you come up and do it?" And I said, "Sure." And we should bring Jared along too, because he's got more experience with the transient killer whales than I do, and he's done more rescues than I have. So even though I'd done one in Barnes Lake before, I thought the 2 of us teaming together would be helpful. And I knew Chloe had been doing work on transient killer whales as well, and thought it would be really valuable to have another scientist along, because in 94 I was the only one. So I think our collaboration with NIMS was a lot stronger in 2023 than it was the first time. And we had people from NIMS on site helping out, with managing the people from the town who are helping out, and then building the hukilau and things like that. Another thing that changed in between was technology, and we had the drones, so we get a top-down view, which, except for the flight in, we didn't get any chance to have. Also the hukilau. So, Jared managed to attract them into the cove, but they kind of, there we go. They decided to mill around in there instead of following Jared. So we did send the hukilau out behind them. And, one of the things we did between the first try and the second try was redesign the hukilau, so you just put it out like a gill net instead of having to go slow and clip the down lines on every time. So they got it across pretty quickly, and once the option going back to the lake was taken away, they followed Jared the rest of the way out. So yeah, so they made it out to open water, and as Jared mentioned, one of them made it all the way down to Seattle. So I kind of call that their thank you tour, where they stopped by Jared's place to thank him, and they came down here to thank me and Chloe. And I'll turn it over to Chloe now.
All right, thank you so much, Dave. Let's see if I can get you unpinned. Please pin. Sorry guys, 1 second. I don't know if you can see all the switching around that I'm doing. Hopefully not. Well, we'll just have Chloe share her screen and then I'll adjust it from there. So up next we have Chloe Kotik. She is a board director with Orca Conservancy, and she is also a PhD student at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, and she is currently studying contamination in killer whales. So she's going to be discussing the body condition of the whales in the lake. So with that, I will go ahead and turn it over to her.
Thanks, Tamara. Yeah, hi, I'm Chloe Kotik. That's actually all my credentials. I'll just go right into it. I'm going to be talking about how we measure whales and how we use this process to estimate the condition of T49A2 and T51 in Barnes Lake. So as Jared and Dave have mentioned, by the time that we arrived on island, the whales had already been in Barnes Lake for about 6 weeks. So we had a few concerns about their welfare in that time, but in particular, we were worried about whether or not they were eating, because we didn't really have much information about prey availability in the lake. We were worried that they were stuck without any food. None of the locals who had been into the lake before us reported seeing any prey items, so top of my list, at least when we got in, was to try and establish the body condition of the whales. And the best way to do that is to get up above them. If you can get a digital photograph of a whale from above, you can actually measure that photograph and do some calculations using the dimensions of your camera sensor and the altitude that the photograph was taken at to convert your measurement from a scale in pixels to a scale in meters. And we call that process photogrammetry, just measuring photographs. Helicopters and small fixed-wing aircraft have been used for marine mammal research for a long time, but in the early 2010s, some researchers started using unmanned aerial systems, what we now call drones, for marine mammal stuff as well. Drones are a lot cheaper than helicopters, and you can deploy them from boats, which makes it possible to start surveying whales in some places that are hard for a helicopter or a small plane to reach. And aerial photogrammetry of killer whales was pioneered by John Durbin, Holly Fernbach, Lance Barrett-Leonard, and Bob Pittman, who did originally use helicopters, but then made the switch to drones about 10 years ago. They developed a couple of different methods to specifically assess the health and body condition of killer whales from above. And I joined John and Holly's team in 2018 when I was an undergraduate, and I worked with them all the way up through my master's using these methods. So when we measure killer whales from above using aerial photogrammetry, there are a few different ways that we can try to look at their condition specifically. And one way is to look at a width profile. So looking at the outline of a whale, you can measure the width of the animal all the way down their body at regular intervals, and you can use that to estimate their surface area. And actually, if you have a view of them from the side as well, you can actually use width profiles to try and estimate the overall volume of that individual, which is really cool. That said, it does take a long time to run these profiles, and it's not always the most sensitive metric. So with killer whales, we like to take advantage of their unique morphology and their coloration to more quickly evaluate their body condition. And the great thing about killer whales is that they have these fat stores just behind their heads, some adipose tissue deposits. And when they're stressed, especially when they're nutritionally stressed, they tend to metabolize that fat. And the loss of mass in that region gives their head an hourglass shape. You heard, I think, Dave say the term peanut head, which is what we call that when they get kind of skinny behind the head there. And so using aerial photogrammetry, we can measure the width of the animal just across their head, and we can use that to get a sense of their overall body condition. And we've got actually two different metrics for doing that. The first one is called the eye patch ratio because it references two widths at specific positions along the eye patches of the whale. And this is a really sensitive metric. It's great for detecting small changes in conditions, so it's ideal for monitoring individuals over time. If you wanted to look at seasonal patterns or differences associated with reproduction, eye patch ratio is fantastic. The only problem with eye patch ratio is that individual killer whales can have unique eye patches, and that can make things a little bit messy when you're comparing eye patch ratios of different individuals. This is especially true when we want to compare across different populations of killer whales. I'm thinking of Antarctic B1s are known for having these really big, beautiful eye patches that stretch down towards their dorsal, but that means that you can't sensibly compare their eye patch ratio to, say, a big killer whale, which has a totally different morphology to the eye patch. So the other metric that we like to use is called the head width ratio. And this just takes a length between the blowhole and the dorsal fin, and then a width across the head at 15% of that length, and it divides the two. So you get a nice unitless ratio, and you can use it to compare condition across whales without worrying about what their eye patches look like or where they're oriented. And this is what that looks like on a real Biggs killer whale. This is an adult female T36A. And the really cool thing about that head width ratio is that you can make comparisons across populations, which is what we did in 2022. We used head width ratio to classify the body condition of mammal-eating Biggs killer whales based on their age and sex, and to see how their condition differed from fish-eating southern resident killer whales. And if you're curious, we do have a paper in Marine Mammal Science that talks all about that in much more detail than I'm going to go into here. So the other great thing is that drones have come a long way in the last 10 years. They're now standard fare for marine mammal surveys, not just for aerial photogrammetry. People use them for population counts, for behavioral observations. You can use them to collect samples from blows or even deploy tags. And they're also really great in emergencies like entanglements and oil spills. And they range in size. So now we still have our massive 8-rotor octocopters that are used for the really high quality photogrammetry. We've also got these little hand-sized models that are perfect for a last-minute lake rescue. So when we got to Barnes Lake, Jared brought his little DJI Mini, and while we were surveying the lake and the whales, he managed to get a few flights over them so that we could take a look. And the good news is that the whales were in pretty good shape. We didn't have the best water conditions, but just looking down at them from the boat, we noticed pretty quickly that these were not starving whales. I think the consensus on the boat that first day was chunky. And in the days that followed, we actually did see a stellar sea lion making a really fast exit from the lake. So it's likely that they were finding something to eat while they were trapped in there. I was able to extract these still images from Jared's videos and to measure both whales. And I found that they had pretty typical head width ratios. The mean head width ratio of an adult male Biggs killer whale, so 15 or older, is 0.52 with a standard deviation of 0.02. And T49A2 was coming in right there. He was about 0.51, 0.52. T51 a little bit lower, 0.48 to 0.49, but that's not very surprising. I've seen in my own samples that these older males, 40 and older, which he is, they tend to be a little bit lower on that head width ratio scale. And so it was really great to see that the whales were doing relatively well despite the circumstances. Obviously, if they're very thin, we'd be worried about their immediate survival because research and also common sense tells us that whales in poor condition have a heightened risk of mortality. Starving to death is a real risk for entrapped whales, as unfortunately was made clear in 1994. But there are also less acute risks that are associated with being thin. For example, it might be that poor body condition can actually affect growth of killer whales. Previous photogrammetry work on residents, both northern and southern, has uncovered recent declines in their maximum adult size, which was linked to their poor body condition. Basically, whales that matured in the 80s and 90s during a period of very poor food availability were reaching shorter adult lengths, about 0.4 meters shorter, than whales that matured in earlier decades. In our 2022 paper, we found that modern adult Biggs killer whales, which are in considerably better condition than residents, had maximum lengths about 0.4 meters longer than resident killer whales. And it is possible that these differences are phenotypic, that they're inherent to these different populations, especially because Biggs killer whales are eating much larger prey, and the sort of skeletal morphology and the musculature of their heads might just be natively larger to help process that bigger marine mammal prey compared to a fish-eating resident. Likewise, it might be that being physically larger is an advantage when you're hunting seals and sea lions, compared to being small and maneuverable to take down fish. But the recency of the decline in the adult lengths suggests that this might partially be a recent response. And given the timeline of poor food availability and poor body condition, we do think that condition might be limiting their growth in some cases. Condition is also really important because we've known for a few decades now that both resident and Biggs killer whales have quite a lot of pollution built up in their bodies. These are coastal whales. They live in close proximity to human development. And so they're exposed to our industrial and commercial and consumer chemicals that run off into marine systems and work their way up the food web. Contaminants tend to build up to higher concentrations in higher level consumers. It's a process we call biomagnification. And so killer whales, especially mammal-eating killer whales like Biggs, have a really severe buildup of these toxic man-made contaminants. And many of these contaminants are persistent, so they don't break down, they're not really metabolized. And they're also lipophilic, which means that they're stored in fatty tissues. In killer whales, that means blubber. And we don't have the best idea about how these contaminants might be affecting killer whales, but we do think it actually depends on their body condition. Whales that are really robust aren't really metabolizing their blubber, which means their contaminants stay put and aren't circulating through their whole bodies. Whereas whales that aren't doing so hot, that are metabolizing their blubber to kind of keep up their energy, they do have contaminants in circulation, and that might put them at a more acute risk from whatever sublethal or lethal toxic effects are associated with all the stuff we're putting into the water. And so that's why it's really important for whales to keep into good condition, and why it's so important for us to monitor their condition as well. I'll wrap it there to leave time for questions, but thank you for your attention, and also want to thank all of our volunteers in Kaufman Cove, especially Cheryl Fecco, Doug Rhodes, Teresa and Gary Van Aken, Jack Mulcair, the NOAA Regional Office, and Mandy Keogh, Orca Conservancy for their support, my PI, Laura Harsman, for encouraging me to dip in the middle of the semester to go save some whales, and of course, John Durbin and Holly Fernback as well. And that's my contact information. Feel free to drop me a line.
Thank you so much, Chloe. That was wonderful. Oops, I didn't mean to mute you. I meant to unpin you. Hold on a second. You can go ahead and unmute if you need to. So, sorry guys, I do this. Okay, so we are gonna go ahead and open up to the Q&A portion, but before we do, I just wanted to again thank all of our presenters for being here. So we're hoping to do more of these speaker series, and we'd like to keep them free to everybody. So I ask that you guys consider making donations to either our guest speakers. So today that's Jared Towers at Basitology, and you can make a donation on their website, basitology.org. You can make donations to Orca Conservancy on our website as well, because we need funding to make these things happen. And you can also support DFO and NOAA by paying your taxes, depending on what country you are in. So thank you guys. There are